The morning I signed those papers, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I remember standing in the hallway outside room 412 at Foothills Medical Center in Calgary, holding a pen that felt like it weighed about 40 pounds. The nurse, a young woman named Cassidy, with tired eyes and a kind voice, had just explained to me for the third time what the form meant. Withdrawal of aggressive intervention. That was the phrase they used, like they'd found a way to make giving up sound clinical, sound manageable, like something you could file away and move on from. My wife, Renata, was 41 years old. She was a high school art teacher in Airdrie. She made the best butter chicken I've ever tasted, even though she insisted every time that she'd lost the recipe and was just winging it. She had a laugh that started quiet and then took over the whole room. She sang off key in the car and never cared. She was the person I called when anything happened, good, bad, confusing, funny, before I even processed it myself. And she was lying in that room with a traumatic brain injury, severe enough that 3 different specialists had told me she was unlikely to ever wake up. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense without the part that came before. It was a Tuesday in late October. Renata had driven to her sister's place in Red Deer for the weekend, a trip she made every couple of months, just the two of them, wine and movies and talking until 2 in the morning. I'd stayed home in Calgary. We had a contractor coming Saturday morning to look at the basement waterproofing, and somebody had to be there. She called me Sunday night, just before she left to drive home. She sounded happy, a little tired, but happy. She told me her sister Fiona had made this ridiculous fondue and they'd watched an old Cate Blanchett film and talked about everything and nothing. She said she'd be home by 10. She wasn't home by 10. At 11:15, my phone rang. It was an RCMP officer calling from a highway just outside Innisfail. There'd been an accident, black ice. Renata's car had crossed the center line and been struck by a pickup truck. She'd been airlifted to Foothills. The next several hours are still a blur to me. This smear of fluorescent lights and strangers in scrubs, and a waiting room chair that I sat in for what felt like 3 days. At some point, Renata's parents arrived from Lethbridge. Her sister Fiona drove down from Red Deer, eyes red and swollen. My brother Victor flew in from Vancouver the next morning. People kept bringing me coffee. I don't think I drank any of it. The neurosurgeon, Dr. Harpreet Sandhu, was thorough and patient. He explained the injury in terms I could mostly follow, a severe diffuse axonal injury, the kind that happens when the brain is violently shaken inside the skull. There was swelling. There was damage to areas that controlled basic function. They'd induced a coma to reduce pressure. They would monitor. They would wait. We waited. The first 2 weeks I barely left the hospital. I slept in the family lounge on a narrow couch with a flat pillow that smelled like disinfectant. Victor stayed with me for the first week, then had to go back. He has 2 kids and a job that doesn't pause easily. Renata's parents took shifts. Fiona came every few days. I appreciated all of it. I also felt, in a way that I couldn't quite explain to anyone, profoundly alone. Because here's the thing about waiting for someone to wake up. There's nothing to do. You sit, you talk to them, even though you don't know if they can hear you, you hold their hand. You stare at the monitors and learn, without meaning to, what all the numbers mean. You start recognizing the nurses by their footsteps. You become a piece of furniture in a room that smells like antiseptic and dry recycled air. 3 weeks in, the medical team requested a family meeting. Dr. Sandhu was there, along with a palliative care specialist, a social worker, and a woman from the patient care team whose name I don't remember. They told us that Renata's brain activity had not improved the way they had hoped, that the window for meaningful neurological recovery was narrowing, that we needed to begin discussing what Renata would have wanted. Renata had never made a formal advance directive. We were 41. You don't think about those things at 41. Or at least we hadn't. I can tell you exactly where I was sitting when they said the words, withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment. I can tell you the color of the carpet, industrial gray-blue, and the hum of the ventilation system overhead. I can tell you that Fiona, who was sitting across from me, started crying quietly and didn't stop. I can tell you that I felt something in my chest close up like a fist. I said I needed more time. They said, of course, take whatever time you need. The problem was that I didn't know how much time I had left to take. I want to talk about my brother-in-law, Philip, here, because Philip is a significant part of this story, and I want to be fair about who he was, or who I thought he was, before everything came apart. Philip Okafor was 46, Renata's older brother. He'd grown up in Calgary, gone to business school in Toronto, come back west and built a property management company that had done quite well. He was the kind of man who always seemed to be on his way somewhere, always with his phone out, always half in a conversation, always optimizing something. Renata used to tease him about it affectionately. She'd say, "Philip thinks life is a spreadsheet." And he'd laugh, because it was true enough that it was funny. He'd flown in from Calgary. Well, he lived in Calgary too, just in a different neighborhood, Aspen Woods, the kind of place with very wide driveways. He came to the hospital regularly. He sat with Renata. He brought food. He seemed to everyone around him like a devoted older brother doing everything right. What I didn't know, what I didn't find out until later, was what he was doing outside the hospital. Renata and I had built something over 15 years of marriage, not extravagantly but solidly. We'd bought our house in Bridgeland in 2014 before prices went fully insane. We had RRSPs, a joint investment account, a small rental property in Cochrane that Renata had inherited from her grandmother. We weren't wealthy. We were just two people who had worked steadily and made decent decisions, and ended up with more than we'd started with. What I also didn't know, because why would I have checked, was that Renata and Philip had a joint power of attorney document that had been set up years ago, before we were married, when their parents had asked both of them to have documents in place. It was meant as a sibling arrangement, a backup for emergencies. Renata had never updated it after we married. She'd never mentioned it to me, either, or if she had, I hadn't understood what it meant. Philip had power of attorney. And while I was sitting in a hospital lounge, sleeping on a flat pillow and staring at ventilator numbers, Philip was quietly consulting with a financial advisor about what would happen to certain shared assets if Renata died without a will. I didn't know any of this at the time. To me, in those first weeks, Philip was just family, grieving alongside the rest of us. The family meeting had shaken something loose in me. I started asking more questions, not because I suspected anything, just because I felt like I'd been passive long enough. I asked about the possibility of transferring Renata to a rehabilitation facility that a colleague of mine had mentioned, a place in Edmonton that specialized in disorders of consciousness. I asked about additional neurological assessments. I asked whether we had fully exhausted the options. The response I got was careful and professional. Dr. Sandhu was always thoughtful. But there was something in the framing, the particular way certain possibilities were described as unlikely to produce meaningful outcomes, that made me want a second opinion. Not because I distrusted Dr. Sandhu, but because I loved my wife and I wasn't ready to close any door until I was certain. I made an appointment to speak with a neurologist at the University of Alberta Hospital in Edmonton. The earliest they could see us, bring her records, was 3 weeks out. I noted it down and said nothing to the family yet. I didn't want to raise hope that might not be warranted. I just needed to know. A week before that appointment, I was called in by the hospital's patient care coordinator. She told me there was a document she needed to discuss with me. A request had been received. She was choosing her words very carefully, I noticed, regarding changes to Renata's care plan. I asked her to explain. She told me that an individual with power of attorney had submitted a request to begin the process of withdrawing life support. I felt the floor tilt. I told her that I was Renata's husband. I told her I had made no such request. She said very gently that the individual in question was not me, the elevator. That's where I heard it. I was leaving the coordinator's office, which was on the 3rd floor, and I took the stairs down to the main floor because I needed the movement. I needed to put one foot in front of the other and feel something solid beneath me. But I pushed open the wrong door and ended up in a service corridor, and there was an elevator there, a staff elevator, and 2 nurses were standing beside it waiting for it to arrive. They weren't speaking loudly. They clearly didn't know anyone was nearby. I heard one of them say Renata's name. I stopped. I don't want to reproduce their exact words, because I don't know that I remember them exactly, and also because what they said was their private conversation. But the substance of it, the thing that stopped my blood, was this. They were discussing the fact that a new treatment protocol had recently been approved for patients with diffuse axonal injuries at a severity level comparable to Renata's. A clinical trial at the University of Alberta. It involved targeted hypothermic intervention combined with a specific pharmaceutical regimen. The results, from what they were saying, had been, and I remember this word exactly, because it landed on me like something physical, remarkable. One of them said something about whether the family knew. The other one said she wasn't sure, that the file had been complicated by the POA situation. The elevator doors opened. They got in. The doors closed. I stood in that service corridor for probably 3 full minutes without moving. Then I took out my phone and called my cousin Shelley, who is a lawyer in Mississauga. I told her what the coordinator had said. I told her what I'd just heard. I told her about the appointment in Edmonton I'd already made. I told her about the power of attorney. Shelley, who does not alarm easily, said 3 words. Don't sign anything. She was on a flight to Calgary the next morning. What came out over the following week was not something I can describe as anything other than a slow unraveling. Not dramatic, not sudden, just detail after detail falling into place in a way that made me increasingly sick to my stomach. Shelley contacted Renata's estate lawyers and requested copies of all relevant documents. She spoke with the hospital's legal team. She pulled the power of attorney document and had it reviewed. The document was valid. Philip did have POA. But, and this is the thing that changed everything, Renata had added an amendment to it 2 years prior, one that required any major medical decisions to be made jointly with her spouse. It was buried in the paperwork. Philip had not disclosed it to the hospital. Whether he'd forgotten it or chosen to omit it was, at that point, something I could only guess at. Shelley did not guess. She documented it. The withdrawal request Philip had filed was, according to the hospital's legal team, not validly authorized under the amended terms of the POA. They suspended the request pending review. They contacted their own legal counsel. Meanwhile, Shelley helped me push forward with the Edmonton appointment. We transferred Renata's records. The neurologist there, a Dr. Yen, who specialized specifically in consciousness recovery, reviewed everything and told us something that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. She said Renata was a candidate for the trial. She said there were aspects of Renata's imaging that, in her clinical view, had been interpreted conservatively. She said she wasn't criticizing the Calgary team. They'd done everything by the standard of care. But there were markers in the scans that, given the new research, warranted a different read. She said that if we moved forward with the protocol, she could not promise anything. She was clear about that, but she said the markers were there. We moved forward. I can't tell you about those weeks without just telling you they were the hardest of my life. Harder, even, than the first ones, because now I had hope, and hope is a more frightening thing to carry than despair. Despair at a certain level becomes its own kind of armor. Hope has no armor. Hope is just open. I visited Renata every day. I talked to her about everything. I told her about the hockey scores even though she barely followed hockey. I told her that the contractor had finally fixed the basement and it had cost $11,000, and I was mildly furious about it. I told her that her plant, the big monstera in the living room that she'd been nursing for 6 years, was somehow still alive, and I wasn't taking credit for it, but I also wasn't not taking credit for it. I held her hand. I told her to come back. Philip, meanwhile, had lawyered up. He wasn't speaking to me. At one point at the hospital, we passed each other in the corridor, and he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not guilt, not anger, something more complicated than either. Like a man who had made a calculation and discovered too late that he'd used the wrong numbers. I've thought about his motivations many times since then. I've tried to be fair. The financial piece was real. The rental property in Cochrane alone was worth somewhere around $400,000 by that point. And without a will, Renata's assets would have passed through the estate in ways that might have benefited her family of origin over me, her spouse. I'm not a lawyer, but Shelley explained it all, and I understood enough. Philip had stood to inherit something significant if Renata died, and the estate went through a certain process. But I also think, and I say this carefully because I don't know what was in his mind, that he might have genuinely believed at some point that he was acting in her interests, that he'd heard enough from the doctors and decided the situation was hopeless, that he was trying to protect what the family had built together, that maybe in some distorted way he thought he was sparing everyone more suffering. I don't know. I'll never fully know. What I know is what he did. The trial protocol took 11 weeks. I will not lie to you and say that Renata woke up like something from a film, eyes opening, recognizing faces, saying my name. It wasn't like that. It was gradual, grinding. 2 steps forward, 1 back, then half a step sideways. It started with small things, a flicker of response to sound, a change in pupil reaction that Dr. Yoon noted on a Thursday morning and called me immediately about. Then some purposeful movement. Then, this was the day I actually cried in front of another person for the first time in 3 months. She squeezed my hand back. Not hard, just a small pressure, but deliberate, intentional. She was in there. By the time spring came around, Renata had been transferred to a neurological rehabilitation facility in Edmonton. She had begun speaking in short sentences. Her memory had gaps, some of which filled in over time, and some of which may never fully close. She had to relearn certain things. Walking on uneven surfaces was difficult for months. Her fine motor control was slow to return. which made her grief for her art practice a particular kind of painful. She is a painter. She is someone who spent 30 hours a week with a brush in her hand before the accident. Coming back to that has been its own long journey. But she came back. She came home to Calgary in August, 10 months after the accident. The Monstera was still alive, which she found disproportionately funny. I didn't tell her immediately about everything with Philip, the POA, the request, all of it. Her neurologist advised us to move carefully with certain information while she was in the early stages of recovery. But eventually, she knew. She had to know. That conversation was one of the hardest we ever had. Not because of her reaction to me, she was grateful, and she was clear about that. And we held on to each other in a way that I think rebuilt something that the last year had quietly eroded. But because of what it meant about her brother. About the family she'd grown up in. About a trust she didn't know she'd been extending. She grieved that. She is still grieving parts of it. Philip did not go to jail. I want to be honest about that. What he did was legally complicated. He had genuine POA, and proving intent to harm versus intent to act on what he believed was best required a standard of evidence that was very difficult to meet. The hospital filed a formal complaint. There were regulatory reviews. His conduct was cited in a legal opinion that, if he'd acted differently, would have opened him to serious civil liability. He settled a financial dispute with Renata's estate out of court, with Shelley's help, for an amount I've agreed not to disclose. He has not spoken to Renata since. She told me once, maybe 4 months after she came home, that she'd thought about writing him a letter. Not to forgive him necessarily, just to say something. She didn't know yet if she would. I didn't tell her what to do. That's not my letter to write. What I want to say, if I'm being honest about why I'm telling this story at all, is that I almost signed those papers. I was this close. I was 43 years old, and I was exhausted, and I was grieving in advance for a woman who was still alive, and I was trusting the information I'd been given, because I didn't know there was another kind of information to ask for. If I hadn't pushed for the Edmonton appointment, if I hadn't gone through the wrong door, if those 2 nurses hadn't been standing by that elevator at that exact moment, talking in the way that healthcare workers talk when they think no one is around. Honestly, candidly, specifically, I don't know what happens next. I don't know if I find out about the trial. I don't know if I find out about the amendment in the POA in time. I don't know if I have enough fight left in me to push against the grain when every instinct I had was telling me to trust the process and let go. So here is what I'd tell anyone who finds themselves in a room like the one I was in, with a pen in their hand and paperwork in front of them, and a room full of kind professionals telling them something is hopeless. Ask for one more opinion, not because the doctors are wrong, they usually aren't, but because medicine is not one voice, and sometimes the voice that knows something different is in a different city, or a different hospital, or a different research trial, and that voice will not come find you. You have to go find it. And if something feels off, if there's a piece of the picture that doesn't sit right, a question you haven't been able to get a straight answer to, an arrangement you didn't know existed, ask someone who can look at it with clear eyes. A lawyer, a patient advocate, a friend with the right knowledge, someone who isn't inside the grief with you and can see what you can't. Renata is sitting in her studio right now. I can hear her moving around in there, the sound of jars being shifted, the soft drag of a canvas. Her hand is steadier than it was 6 months ago. She's been working on a large piece for the last few weeks, something with a lot of blue and gold, and she won't show me until it's done, which is how it's always been. I knocked on the door last night just to see her face. She looked up and smiled and told me to stop hovering. I told her I was absolutely not hovering. She said, "You're always hovering." She's right. I probably always will be now. I don't think that's the worst thing.